Good morning. We are back to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, chapter 472, Siman Tuf Ayin Beis, the laws of Heseba, the laws of reclining, the obligation to recline in demonstration of our freedom on the Seder night. So we covered the manner of reclining, that is to say, to the left, not to the right, not to forward, not back. We discussed the origins of the reclining commandment, that is to say, it's born out of our obligation to demonstrate our freedom, right? Highlight the word demonstrate, in addition to just feeling, but actually to demonstrate it, along with the rest of the evening, as we learned based on Never's insights, along with in the context of the entire evening's obligation to relate the story, to demonstrate it and to show it to others. So the same thing with our freedom as expressed in our position of sitting and reclining. We also discussed this idea that even a poor person is required to recline. We got some insight from the Rebbe in his commentary to the Haggadah, citing two midrashim, which describe how when the Jews leave, Hashem is carrying them, reclining them like kings would be reclined, as if to say, this is what we suggested yesterday, as if to say, notwithstanding whatever personal circumstance, one lets go and lets Hashem do the carrying, then he's reclining like a king. So it kind of gives us an insight into how a person can achieve this kind of feeling on the Seder night or any time of reclining and having this faith and trust that Hashem is carrying us around. Okay, so now we get back to the Shulchan Aruch, which discusses the details of who's obligated to recline. The Gemara discussed it as well, of course, discussing the fact that a woman in presence of her husband doesn't recline. Student and teacher relationship, we had one version that said yes, one version that said no. If you're an apprentice for just a job, then no, then you do recline. And we had a child does recline in the presence of the father, son in the presence of the father. And then we had the servant as well. So now we're going to unpack all that in more detail. Halacha Yud, Isha, a woman, Bein Nesua, whether she is married, Bein Almana, whether she's divorced, Ugrusha, or Almana, widowed, Grusha, or divorced. And like he points out in footnote 39, the same rule applies to a woman who is not yet married. Eina tzricha seva.
What else is
a woman who's never been married? You have a married woman, a widowed woman, or a divorced woman.
No,
then there's a woman who hasn't been married.
That also includes
who's never been married. Right? A single woman.
Why would you then single out these? It means all of it. No?
I think it means even. Or actually, good question. Don't know the answer. Good question. At any rate, Eina tzricha seva does not require reclining. Because it's not the manner of women to recline, and this is not the manner in which they demonstrate their freedom. So we're noticing a nuanced difference between this and the Gemara. You may remember the Gemara, where there we discussed a woman in presence of her husband.
Yeah.
Now here he's talking about whether a married woman, divorced or single or widowed. That would mean even not in the presence of her husband.
Right. So why is the Gemara singling out?
Or why is the Shulchan Aruch expanding it?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And especially since the rationale we gave then from the Rashbam, because in the presence of her husband, she's she's the nurturing one who like positions her husband on a pedestal, and therefore she doesn't take the liberties of just reclining. She's like stands there in support of her husband, so to speak. Right, so she's not in a reclining position, which would almost sound like if she's not with her husband, then go ahead and recline.
But
But the Shulchan Aruch says beyond that. So let's look at Halacha at footnote 40. So let's look at footnote 40. Psachim mentioned, said it earlier. Footnote 40, you see it?
Yeah. Footnote. Got it.
Psachim makes such a statement about a married woman in the presence of her husband. the halachic authorities in the era immediately after the redaction of the Talmud, that is to say, the Gaonim, Si She'iltot of Achai Gaon, Parshas Tzav, expand the scope of the exclusion to all women.
Oh, so that's a rabbinic enactment.
It's a post-Talmudic enactment.
Not the same thing.
It's not the same. Well, it is. When you say rabbinic enactment, the implication is that it's from the Sanhedrin or from the Anshek Nesagdolo or from the times of the Gemara.
Oh.
This is it is rabbinic, technically speaking, but it's a post-Talmudic, to make it clear. It's the Gaonim, which this Monday night we'll be talking about, God willing, the transition between Talmud.
That's why when you read the Talmud,
it's not there, right? So this comes from the post-Talmudic era, which is still nonetheless something of note, and we should probably look up the She'ilta to get a proper understanding. But the rationale is still presented here. In that, in addition to, in other words, it comes back to what we've been talking about before, that the reclining is a requirement, but it's also a requirement meant to demonstrate something. It's meant to demonstrate freedom. That's what it's born out of. Now, for a particular class of people, reclining is not the manner in which they demonstrate their freedom, then they ought not to recline, or at least aren't required to. If for a certain class of people, reclining is not the manner in which they demonstrate their freedom, that they either ought not, or at least they aren't required to.
It's not the manner in which they demonstrate that freedom.
That's correct, because again, it's not an independent like mitzvah, like the mitzvah of eating matzah is irrespective of whether you like matzah or not. The mitzvah of reclining is born out of the obligation to demonstrate freedom. So if for, let's say, reasons of modesty, this is not the way in which women demonstrate their freedom, then reclining will not do. And therefore, like the language here is not required to recline. Not forbidden, but not required. We'll get to soon whether they should or shouldn't. That's the language here. In it, say we're not required, because it's not the way in which they'll express their freedom. Yeah. Might be other ways. Dress well, be one way. Lots of beautiful jewelry. Another way. Lots of other ways they can express their freedom. But the reclining isn't one of them. This is the Gemara of the post-Talmudic era's decision. Okay.
So presumably women would recline post-Talmudic.
At which point did this culture change? I don't know. They wouldn't have reclined even if they were married, even if they weren't with their husbands, is the point.
They would.
They wouldn't have reclined.
You mean even during the Gemara?
I don't know which point it changed.
I'm saying.
And whether the Gemara means
they did recline
before.
Free.
Well, if we're going to take the Gemara's language where it says before then, if we take the Gemara's words at face value, which states that woman in the presence of her husband, and then give the rationale that because she's in the presence of her husband, that's why she's not reclining, the implication would be that she wasn't in the presence of her husband, she would recline. So I don't know when it switched, or if it always was like that, but it was only the Gaonim who pointed it out.
And is there commentary as to their decision?
Perhaps, probably. We'll have to look up.
But I think you're right. I mean,
have to look up
on the lines of what you were saying.
Let's look up there was commentary also here. Now got it.
It could be just if decided that not the way in which women.
Yeah, I imagine it has a lot to do with modesty.
And modesty.
Yeah, you can look it up. We'll pull up my computer and see if I have the She'iltos here. You know where it might be. I'll tell you. Let's try that. Give me 2 seconds. Let's see if I can pull it up. Halacha. I'll try it in Hebrew. 1 second, if it's not. She'iltos. Here we are. Yeah, it's here. Okay, does it give a number 40 what She'iltos it is? Does it give a number?
No.
It just says Parshas Tzav, right?
Yeah, Parshas Tzav.
Okay, that makes it a little more vague. Because here it's organized by numbers, so let's see.
What is She'iltos?
She'iltos are Q&A from the post-Talmudic era.
It's like a responsa?
It's early version of responsa.
Early version of responsa.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, but I see it's divided by it's divided by. Okay, I see. Shivasaka and them. Just gonna have to find filters. Okay, I have to spend a little more time looking it up on my computer.
It also could be not to confuse the masses. That some women may observe, hey, this woman's reclining, but I'm not reclining.
Yeah, there's certainly halacha is more apt towards being uniform. That's
uniform,
for sure. To make, even though there might be exceptions to the rule, you have to look at the one from Achagon. Okay, well, we'll have to do more proper
look. Because why I think that footnote included single women is because you have 3/4 of the population of women who are not reclining, and therefore this.
Also, in the old day, women got married much younger, so a single woman participating at the seder is much less common.
Very common either. So
they got married much younger.
That would even narrow the pool even more to those who weren't.
Exactly.
I mean, who were reclining.
Right, and therefore
bring everybody in at this point.
Basically,
it could be a consideration as well.
Perhaps. Okay, anyway, continue. The imi chashuva, if she's a woman of repute, she's a prominent woman, and therefore she would entertain while reclining. But then she's indeed required to recline. Now says the Alter Rebbe, you're gonna love this. All of our women today, chashuvas are considered prominent women nowadays. And this goes, looking at the footnote, it goes as far back as the Rishonim era, the Tosfos era. So, which means at some point it was only women in front of their husbands don't recline because they're subject to their husbands and are there to prop their husbands up. Fine. Then it went to, well, women in general don't do that because, I guess, because of modesty, it's not their way of doing things. But if they're prominent and they have that, then recline. But today they're all like that. All women have that prominence. A little nod to the feminist.
So then you recline to them?
Nonetheless, like no, it's not their custom to recline. Why? It explains because there are those that say.
Are we back?
Yeah, back in the text of Shulchan Aruch. Yes. Yeah. The third line there. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down from the Yud. All of women, all of our wives today, all women today, chashuvas are considered prominent, and therefore would require reclining. Not because nonetheless, like they aren't it's not their custom to recline. Why? Because others that say, shivas manazet nowadays, post temple period, ain't there loss of cloud. There's no reason to recline at all today. Why would that be the reason? Because even the rest of the year, because no one reclines to demonstrate their freedom nowadays.
That seems to go beyond the issue of woman.
Exactly. So to begin with, the whole thing is an issue, a questionable issue, considering that, well, nowadays no one reclines to demonstrate freedom, as per Alan's point. Okay. Right? And like he says there, even kings and noblemen sit regularly. Yeah. So therefore, in other words, there's an equality between men and women today, but not an equality that everybody reclines, but an equality that everybody doesn't recline. And therefore, I'll devreihem on their words. There are women that rely and just say, you know what, what do I have to lean for at all? The whole leaning is a questionable thing. Whereas the men retained the original enactment and said, you know, we'll just keep on reclining. That's the way it always was. I don't know that who's making this constant decision. If men had a council and said, hey, let's all recline. If women had a council and said, hey, let's all not recline. But in other words, because from the Gemara's language, there already is a split between men and women to begin with in the attitude towards reclining. Mm-hmm. And especially in a post-Talmudic era where there was this idea that women don't have to recline at all because it's just not their way of expressing freedom. So what followed from that was, well, no one's ways to expressing freedom. If women never express their freedom through reclining, and nowadays no one expresses themselves through reclining, so let's just continue to not recline.
It's like the women put the lean position on
It kind of right, but it evolved naturally. In other words, if the Goyim pointed out that, hey, women don't really recline, so at that point women weren't reclining, but men do recline, so men were reclining.
Right.
Then as the custom changed, so at that point men were reclining, women weren't reclining because each were respectively expressing their freedom in their right way. Now times changed and no one's reclining, but the men were used to reclining because that was the way they expressed their freedom for the last couple hundred years. So they just kept on doing it. Whereas the women were never doing it to begin with because that wasn't their way of expressing freedom in the first place. So when they come today and men aren't doing it because they're holding on to tradition, the women are just like, we're also holding on to tradition, which by the way, doesn't even apply nowadays. Not that they were making this logic, but that's the way it evolved. Mm-hmm. Right? That's not that there was a council coming together and making this decision, but it actually rationally makes sense that we've evolved that way. Like you can imagine a conversation of like, why are you reclining now? No one reclines. Well, that's how Jews always practiced at the Seder. We always reclined. But the women didn't always recline because even then they weren't expressing their freedom through reclining. So they just maintained that not reclining. And there's room to say that they can do that because, hey, no one reclines. And men just maintained the reclining because, hey, we were doing it before the customs in the world changed. Follow?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the rationale of how it just evolved.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in support of that, I think too, even the men, most, from what I've experienced, there are many men who just don't recline. I think it's mostly because they're not aware of it, because it fell out of
common practice.
Practice.
Exactly.
Unless they see it written as an instruction in the
exactly.
Right.
In other words, what you're saying is exactly.
They won't know to do it because
exactly.
It's a lot of practice.
No, that's right. That's the point. In other words, what you're saying is, I think this is correct. Society as a whole stopped reclining, except for the men who want to keep the tradition. That's the point. So the women didn't have a tradition to keep anyway.
Yeah.
Because to begin with, they weren't expressing their freedom through reclining. So when the society changed and caught up to women who aren't reclining, women just stayed not reclining. Whereas some of the men just kept them reclining because, hey, that's what we were always doing. If they were aware of that custom and felt it important to maintain that tradition. Or because they read the Haggadah and Haggada's instruction said, hey, recline now. Right?
Yeah.
But because there's a very strong argument to be made, they said the whole recline doesn't apply anyway. Because it's all subjective to express your freedom, as we learned. Others might argue back and say, well, the sages enacted that the way to express your freedom is reclining, so that remains even if society changed. Some might argue that. And if that were the case, then women should recline, because they're all considered prominent. But women in maintaining their custom are just sticking with the other rationale, which is the whole thing was subjective to what's the way in which you express freedom, and freedom is expressed by reclining, so we're not reclining, just like we never did, because that was never a way of expressing our freedom. Right? So there's the two ways. All right. Well, this plays right into like what we're learning on Monday nights and the transmission of halacha, and you can see how these things evolve over time. So here's an interesting one because it's an enactment that embedded in it is an understanding of how people behave. Right? You need to demonstrate your freedom. Well, how do people do that? Oh, people recline. Do they still? And if they don't, then we abolish the sorry? We don't eat in divans anymore. We are sitting at chairs upright. Even the biggest of kings doing it. This is already a couple hundred years ago. They're saying this in European lands. I could see from the sources. It's Bali Taisus. It's all European Ashkenazic halakha authorities.
That's a physical expression of how it changed.
Exactly.
We don't eat like this.
We just don't do that anymore. Exactly. So, well, and it gets to understanding each individual enactment. Was the enactment made that this is the way you have to behave, even if circumstances change? Or, well, the point is express your freedom and just see how people do that nowadays and do that. Right? So there's different ways of thinking of the same enactment. Mm-hmm. Right? And that would change whether you're sitting upright.
The obligation to express your freedom still applies.
Exactly.
Whether or not it's through a practice that no longer
exists. Right.
Exists.
So how fixed were the sages when they enacted reclining? Were they so fixed that said this is the way to do it, and therefore no matter what happens to society, you still have to express it by reclining? Or do they say express your freedom, and whatever society does to do that, do that? In terms of the way you sit.
Because, especially when it says, what is the word? Present yourself.
That's correct. Demonstrate your freedom. Present yourself. It's correct.
Well, if nobody reclines today,
then someone walking to my
How
house
is
seeing
that a
reclining is not going to demonstrate anything.
It
Exactly.
has been a utility.
That's right. Or the sages said this is the way you do it, and therefore that's it. Like, for example, the sages said the way you demonstrate the miracle of Hanukkah is by lighting menorah. So someone who doesn't know the story, doesn't know the background, looks at the menorah, doesn't see any demonstration of anything. It doesn't matter. This is the way the sages enacted the way you demonstrate the miracle, right? So does that the same thing apply to reclining? Whether people observe it or not observe it doesn't matter. The sages enacted that this is the way you demonstrate your freedom. Or no, whatever, just demonstrate your freedom, however it's done. Today we do it reclining. Today some women don't. Tomorrow some women will, because that's the way society changed. And the day after that, women won't, because that's the way society changed. And then the day after that, no one will, because that's the way society changed. But figure out your own way to demonstrate your freedom. Dress well, make sure your table is set well, make sure you're sitting on a comfortable chair, not on the floor, whatever the thing is. Right?
I think it's stuck somewhere in between two of those polar opposites.
And if a woman fell on this side,
because they're still leaning, but a lot are not.
That's right. So women fell on that side because even when men were leaning, they weren't leaning. Right. So women fell on the side of don't lean because they never were leaning, even when men were leaning. And the men, many of them stuck on the side of, well, we'll continue leaning because that's our tradition. We'll just keep on doing it, even though society changed. And we'll go with the view that says
because there's no other method that has been
adopted. That's right.
To say this is how today. It's really not that
right.
either.
Because we don't have any method of alternative to demonstrate our sitting differently now than we would on a regular day. That's right. So maybe that would lend itself to the thinking, well, the sages enacted reclining, so recline. Keep on reclining as per tradition. Right, as per the sage's decision to make a difference in the way you sit in order to.
It's not so bad either.
And that's what Alter says. The women who don't recline are relying on this opinion. Right. Not because they all got together in council and said, hey, let's follow this opinion. Because of the way things evolved, both of these things can be simultaneously true. And each maintain their tradition in a correct manner of different understanding of the original enactment. It's such a funny but beautiful thing. Husband and wife are sitting at the same table, practicing different things for different understandings of the same law. That's great. You have a better appreciation when you understand how halacha evolves. You understand how that can happen, even though both the men and the women are completely unaware of this whole discussion. But in reality, their behavior, that's right, their behavior is acting out two completely different understandings of how halacha evolved.
Without them even knowing it.
Without them being aware of it at all.
Actually practicing it.
That's correct. It's a beautiful thing. Yeah, this really does play into what we're learning about. Because actually, God willing, this coming Monday, we're going to be discussing Torah in Babylonia. So we're going to go through the Talmudic era and then the post-Talmudic era, the Goinim that we referenced here.
Oh, good.
That's going to be this Monday night. Okay, let's continue. Next halacha. Ben ha'echel etzel aviv, a son in the presence of his father, tzarech haseva, is required to recline. Yeah, as the Gemara said. Afilu im aviv rabbi muvak. Even if his father is also his absolute teacher. Right? Look at footnote 42 to understand what this means. Rabbi Muvak is foremost teacher. The Alter Rebbe uses the term Rabbi Muvak, translated as his foremost teacher. This term has a specific halachic meaning, the mentor from whom one derives most of his Torah knowledge. Okay, this gets to the Gemara's discussion, right? Because the Gemara just talked about a father and son, and that a son is allowed to recline in the presence of his father as opposed to a woman in the presence of her husband, because the son doesn't have the same sort of obligation to prop up the father. On the contrary, the father wants to educate the son on how to be a man of the house, so to speak, so he reclines. And then the Gemara said, well, if you're sitting at your teacher, who's your Rabbi Muvak, your primary teacher, like a chassid in the presence of a Rebbe, no reclining. What if your father is the Rebbe?
That's a good question. That's
what he's addressing right here. He says you do recline. Why? The fisha min hastam, because we assume ha'av Michael al kvoidoi livnoi. Our father will forego his own honor for the sake of propping up his son. And therefore, even if his father has Rebbe status, he wouldn't recline in his presence. He would recline in his presence.
What does it mean, propping up his son?
He forgoes his own honor. Sorry?
Is this the part where he's educating him to be
that's my reading into it. The literal translation is he forgoes his own honor in the presence of it. He forgoes his own honor on behalf of his son. In other words, his honor as the Torah leader is to have his students sit at attention, not recline. But for his son, he'll forgo that requirement that they all sit at attention and allow him to recline. Because on the contrary, he wants to give his son a good time, so to speak. He wants to, right? The manner in which the father educates a child is the way a teacher educates a child, right? And therefore, the child, even if his father happens to be the Rebbe, would still recline, or at least if it happens to be the his primary teacher, which if it wasn't his father, he wouldn't be reclining.
The other, practically speaking, right? You have a Rebbe, the son is there, and the other.
And the Hasidim aren't reclining, and the Rebbe,
reclining,
and
along
yeah,
with his father.
yeah.
I guess they would understand.
Yeah. Now he goes conversely. But a student is eating in the presence of his teacher. Even if he's not this great status of the best teacher. It's not appropriate to recline. So when it's a child, even if his father is at the highest level, Rabbi Muvak, recline because his father forgoes the honor.
Yeah.
A teacher, a student in the presence of a teacher would recline, even though it's not his greatest teacher, because it's still his teacher. Out of honor and respect and awe and reverence to his teacher. Should not recline. It's not inappropriate for him to recline.
Oh, not. Sorry.
Should not recline. Elam Cain, unless the teacher gives the child the student permission to recline. Then he's obligated to recline. The ain chiyuv al rav the teacher is not required to forgo his honor for the sake of allowing his student to recline. If he wants to grant permission to his student to recline, he may do so. He's not required to do so. Right? Meaning, it's not demeaning to the honor, as he points out in footnote 43, it's not demeaning to the honor of Torah for him to give permission.
In the father's case.
In the case of Rebbe Chassan, by the way, I can't say for sure, but it would seem to me that I don't know of any precedent where the Rebbes gave permission for their Chassidim to recline in front of them. I don't know if that was the case. And presumably because of the Rebbe's status, not his own, but because of what he represents, it might be a denigration to his office if he let his Chassidim recline. As opposed to an ordinary teacher and a student, the teacher could say, look, go ahead, recline. And it's not going to be a major dishonor to the office of the teacher that he's reclining. It's okay. That's what I would think. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Teacher would have to give permission to the student
to allow him to recline, yeah.
Father doesn't have to grant permission to his son, right? If the son on his own initiative decided to recline, but the father was not too thrilled about it, presumably father has to forego his honor.
No, the assumption is he does.
Assumption is he does.
Yeah, the assumption is it does. The assumption is the father forgoes the honor to allow his child to recline. Yeah. Now it continues. All of the above is if he's sitting at the same table as the teacher. If he's sitting at a different table, even if he's in the same room, then the student is required to recline. Even if it's his primary teacher, this Rabbi Muvak status, where most of his Torah comes from this one person, and Gadol B'Dorei. This person is the greatest sage, leading sage of the generation. You're talking about the presence of the Rebbe. If he's at a different table, then he may recline.
He must recline.
Must recline. Not may recline, yes, must recline, correct. Base. All of this is the Talmud Shel Torah, a student-teacher relationship with regard to study of Torah. But a teacher who teaches a profession, even though he has this reverence for his teacher who's teaching him a profession, and he honors him and he services him, he's apprenticing by him, and he's got the greatest respect for him because he's putting him on his feet, giving him a parnasa, yada yada yada. He's required to recline even in his presence, even at the same table. Because his reverence for his teacher is not right. The Gemara's language was that because Rashbam at least said this. I think the Gemara said so too. But certainly Rashbam said this. Matt, give me 1 second. The reverence from the teacher that tells him he can't recline is an extension of his reverence for heaven. Yeah, the Gemara said so. Yeah. But here, even though there's a reverence, but the reverence here is not an extension of the reverence of heaven. It's a reverence because you're thankful to a God giving you parnas, helping you with parnas.
reverence on
a human level.
On a human level.
And therefore, your obligation to Hashem supersedes your reverence on the human level. But if the teacher itself, the reverence there is in your relationship with God, then that reverence supersedes your reclining. Unless, of course, the teacher gives permission. Continuing, same thing true with servants and maidservants, waiters. Yeah. Ivrim, they're Jewish. They require reclining. Applicant nonetheless, even though they're constantly running back and forth to serve the meal, because that's their job, they're waiters. At the moment when they sit down to eat that bit of matzah to fulfill their obligation of eating matzah, and likewise afikoman, the second matzah that they eat at the end of the seder to remind us of the Pesach offering, and at the time when they drink the 4 cups of wine, because those are the times when the primary obligation to recline is in effect, as we shall explain, right? Because again, as we learned, the obligation to recline is all night, but the primary times in which to demonstrate that reclining is matzah 1, matzah 2, afikoman, and 4 cups of wine. Therefore, at the bare minimum, these servants who are running around, or these waiters that are running around, when it comes time for them to drink their 4 cups of wine or eat their matzah, eshlela mahasev, they are capable of reclining and therefore should recline.
Yeah, for the same reason, I guess, of the trade being taught, right?
Sorry?
It's for the same reasoning that we just learned before, that it's like the tradesman who's being taught apprentice and then master trade. It's a human.
That's correct. The reverence that the servant has to have to his employer is a human in nature. Yeah. The only reason to not obligate them is because their time is not theirs, and therefore they can't. Like, for example, a proper servant of the old day isn't obligated in time-bound mitzvahs. But here, because because you have your time to eat your matzah anyway, so therefore you can recline, and because you can, you have to. If it was taking up time from your employers paying you, then maybe you would have to cut it. Like, for example, we learned about Shema and davening, depending on the nature of the employment, he might have to make a shorter prayer, right? Because he's taking up time that doesn't belong to him. But here, the reclining takes up no time. And if you're eating matzah anyway, so you could recline, therefore you have to recline. That's what the Shulchan Aruch is telling us.
It's also tied to what we learned yesterday about you can equate the manservant with a poor person, meaning that no matter what the circumstances are, it's not a humanistic.
That's right. It's Hashem carrying you in reclining. So even if you happen to be a servant right now, you still have to recline. Yes, indeed. Okay. There's another line that I want to look at.
That's a true demonstration.
That's a demonstration of freedom. Even as I have a master and I'm still reclining. That's right. Okay. We'll stop here and God willing more tomorrow. There's actually one more line here related to the subject, but I want to do a little unpacking, so we'll do that tomorrow. Wonderful day, Eden.
Thank you.